Hi, it's Nick here from Conservation Careers, and welcome to the podcast. Now, a key to success within conservation is the ability to design high quality projects to protect species, habitats, and sites. But only a small portion of professional conservationists are formally trained in these essential skills of project design and management. Now, with limited time and money available within the sector, it's no surprise that employers are increasingly looking for staff with project design and management training. And to talk about this and much more is our latest course leader from Conservation Careers, Felix Cybulla. Now, Felix is an independent consultant who has been training teams for over a decade in the world-class approach to project design and management, which is called the Conservation Standards. Now, in this episode, we talk about his work as a conservation consultant and how conservationists could achieve more impact and employability through improved project skills. He also shares what it's like to work as a freelancer within the sector, along with providing a powerful example of how fuel-efficient stoves shows that conservation is all about working with people. Now, if you enjoy this episode and you want to learn more about improving your project skills and get more support from Felix, you can check out our course, Conservation Project Management and Design. So enjoy this wide-ranging, adaptively managing a fuel stove burning episode.
Hi, my name is Felix Cybulla. I work as an independent consultant in nature conservation.
Hey, well, welcome, Felix. Thank you for joining the Conservation Careers podcast. It's always nice to connect. I feel like we're getting to know each other quite well now because you're helping with one of our courses, but we're here to talk about you today, your career, and really how you go about working as an independent consultant within this sector, as almost like a freelancer, which is quite an interesting career in itself to be sharing. Where to start? Well, let's start with you and your job right now. You're an independent freelancer. You've been doing that for over 10 years?
Been doing this for over 10 years by now. Yeah, it's amazing, but yeah, over 10 years now.
Right. Okay. And what is it? I mean, how would you describe your role and your duties to people that don't understand the sorts of work that you do? Like, what is your typical job?
Mm. Whenever I meet people and I try to explain what I do, it's a little bit complicated, but in essence, I consult teams, I support teams, conservation teams around the world, trying to overcome certain challenges or trying to accompany them through processes. These may be design processes of new strategy or strategic plans. Mm-hmm. It could also be strategy evaluation. It could be a whole project or program evaluation. It could be a midterm evaluation. So there's all sorts of different processes or assessments that teams pull me in order to support them and provide good guidance and an outside perspective on their work.
Right.
In a nutshell, that's what I do.
Yeah, that's really clear. And why do people use consultants like yourself? Why don't they just do it all in-house? Like, what's the need for getting someone like you in? And I guess perhaps like, what's your expertise? What are they looking for that perhaps they can't source, internally?
That's a good question. I think, in a perfect world, my job would be obsolete, right? Because the teams have all the capacity, they have all the knowledge, they have all the experience. Maybe the only thing that a team usually does not have is that outside perspective that I just mentioned, right? So it's, of course, always great to have someone external come have a look at things. You explain your ideas, your theory about why you're doing what, and then that outside person can provide a feedback, let's say, right? And you take it or not. Mm-hmm. So that's, in every situation in life, that is usually beneficial for whatever you're doing. So that's definitely one aspect that why people try to call me up to support them. But then, as we've mentioned, many of the teams simply don't have the capacity to do these types of assessments, either because they're too busy with day-by-day work, and so they're trying, to get someone else to structure that process, to provide deadlines. Sometimes even it's really just that, or a structure to to a certain workflow. And sometimes, of course, it's also the expertise that they say, we want to do a threat analysis. We really want to understand, the things that are threatening our conservation targets. So the things that we try to protect, but we don't know how to go about it, right? Or we're trying to assess, how healthy that ecosystem or that national park or the species in that national park are, but we just don't know how to do that. And we know there's guidance here and there, but we've heard, you have done this before. Would you be able to help us? And so that's when I, could then say, yeah, that's something I can help you with. Or sometimes I also have to say, I'm actually not the right person. You might want to call up someone else.
Right.
Sometimes I can recommend my colleagues or people that I know of.
Okay. Yeah. So you sort of draw on your network, make introductions, and try and make that conservation happen. Yeah.
Of course, because I do understand the need from a team, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm, I can't fix everything, and I'm not knowledgeable around all of the topics. And speaking of which, I mean, the content always belongs to the team. So I'm no expert, even though I have a background in forest ecosystem management. I'm no expert in, let's say, the Peruvian lowland rainforest.
Yeah.
And so all of that inside knowledge must come from the team. I am really there to provide a structure to the process, to bring a methodological background to the team and to a process where I think it would be beneficial for them to go through that, and combining it with their on-site knowledge.
I've got you.
That's sort of like where the harmony comes, right? And
yeah.
where things come together. And
that's where the magic happens. So you've got the
yeah.
team on the ground. They have the knowledge. They understand the local context, the issues. Right. What you have, your expertise, is the process and how to process and systematize their knowledge into something which can have an impact on whatever it is they're looking to impact, whatever they're looking to improve. Yeah. I guess what we don't want to do is go right in on kind of specific examples, because obviously that's between you and the people that you work with. But can we talk sort of generally? Let's. I'm trying to understand, like, how do you work at an operational level? So if let's say I contracted you, I work for conservation org, let's call that, and I say, right, Felix, I'd really like to improve my population of barn owls in my local area here. They've been declining for 10 years, and me and my team really want to kind of bring them back. What's your process then? So I've got a species that's in decline. Walk me through in kind of, general terms, like how would we work together to develop a project that would help my local barn owl population?
Well, in the end, it depends, of course, on a few points. First of all, is it just going to be you, or do you work with a team? Is there more people? Like, am I going to be working with just you alone? Yeah. Or is there a wider team that defines, of course, the process and how we structure, workshops or trainings or in the meetings, online or in-person meetings?
That's sort of like, let's say there's a team, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So let's assume it was a team. I would then basically, at the beginning, really just through one or two calls, try to really identify what they're really asking for. I mean, we're all trying to protect something, but usually these teams already have a very good understanding of the situation on site, right? And I can get, simply by asking or simply by, talking about it, I can get a very good feeling for what are the critical issues that they're facing, which dynamics within that system, exist, what do we have to watch out for, sort of like, like on a very high level, trying to assess that situation. And then from there on, I would structure, or I would design a process, or sit down and compile certain, let's say, work steps to outline a, let's say, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 days process, sometimes much longer, of course, to then present to the team. And if they agree and say, yeah, that's exactly what that's exactly what we need, or we trust you that this is, something that would get us to that final stage of where we understand our system better, or where we can protect that species better, and then we start. And usually these components within that plan they usually almost always start with a situation analysis.
Right.
That really assesses what is happening on the ground. So what are you trying to protect? From what do you try to protect it from, right? So what are the direct threats that are putting your beloved elements at risk, right? So protecting a jaguar population or a rainforest or coral reefs. I mean, whatever it is, right?
So in my example, it would be, I want to protect barn owls, and they are threatened by pesticides like rat poison and things like that. They are threatened by loss of nest sites. So trees are being felled down, old buildings where they nest are also being converted into nice houses. And rough grassland where their small mammal prey is being removed and it's been intensified so we can grow more crops. That would, I guess, that is that a situation analysis a little bit?
That's the start of a situation analysis. So what we now have is, I understand what you're trying to protect. I understand sort of like the negative dynamics that are threatening your species, and then we would go, of course, way beyond that and say, what are the reasons why people cut down trees? Why are we building houses? Why? So what are the underlying contributing factors or the drivers or the underlying root causes that actually create those threats, right? The things that lead to the decline of your species. And so with that, we have these three, let's say only three elements, and then we can go into the details, right? We can do a health assessment, what we call a viability assessment on your target, and really assess how healthy is it. And maybe you find out it's actually not that bad, or maybe you find out, oh my God, it's on the brink of extinction. And then my next question, of course, would be, well, is it really worth saving, right? If you only have one elephant left in the forest, I understand it's an iconic species, but it cannot reproduce if it's just one single elephant, right? So we come to some very heartbreaking questions sometimes, but in order to be efficient and like not only in the way we act, but also financially efficient, we sometimes need to ask those questions, right?
Yeah, that must be right.
And that's also that outside view, right? You've been working on that species for the last 25 years, so it doesn't even cross your mind that you might even have to ditch the species because there's simply no hope, right? Or provide a corridor and work more on, let's say, a systems level to reestablish a corridor where that last species can sort of like move, especially given climate or climatic changes, move towards other areas where, let's say, there is more suitable habitat, or where there is other individuals of that same species, genetic diversity, where actually reproduction can then again happen. So, I mean, it's a very complex topic, and none of the places are ever the same. There is, structural similarities, yes, but all of the sites really need their own thorough situation analysis and assessments, and that's only to assess what is happening, right? We then would go into strategy designing, right, and really brainstorm on strategies. So how do you want to protect it? How do you want to abate certain threats? How do you want to solve this issue that we are cutting down trees or that we are building new houses? I mean, can't just not build new houses, but maybe there's something in between, right? Or maybe we can actually not build houses. It always depends on the situation on site. But it can be a very let's say complicated or complex process, and sometimes very frustrating, I have to be honest. Not because the teams that I work with, but because the circumstances are so tough sometimes, right? That it can be very energy draining, but it's always also very rewarding to work on those fantastic species or places, and usually with very dedicated people. That's what drives me and what gives me energy, even though we are facing some of the worst challenges globally speaking at this point, that we have faced in a long time, if not forever. But yeah, it's still fun.
It sounds, yeah. And even like with my sort of silly example of barn owls, you sort of see that you very quickly get some quite big issues like house building and agricultural intensification, and tackling those when you're a small team and a conservation organization can be a huge challenge. Like, where do you go and what impact can you really have? And where do
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And especially because the days of where we just say, let's fence off that forest because it's so pristine and natural, and all will be good, these days are over, right? And nature conservation is always about people as well. So you always need to find that equilibrium, that balance in between what do we take or what do we have to take out, from an ecosystem, the services that it provides us with, and to what extent can and must we protect it also. So there is no place on this planet that I know of where we can simply say, let's put a fence around it and no one is allowed into it and everybody will be happy. No, people usually depend on those resources. It's just a matter of finding ways and alternatives in order to not exploit it to the degree where the system collapses.
Yeah. And that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I know you a little bit in your background, and you've developed something like fuel efficient stoves in Africa. That's been like a project that you've been developing now for a while. And that's sort of linked to trying to take pressure off an ecosystem, if I understand it correctly. Can you just sort of dive into that for a second then? What are these fuel efficient stoves and how does that help, local communities and perhaps wildlife too? I mean, I suspect there's a link there.
No, of course there's a direct link. So that project, it's a funny story because we founded an NGO basically some 13, 14, 15 years back while we were still studying, basically over a beer, right? So we sat down in the evening and wondered or asked ourselves, why do you need $1 million or euros to create a conservation project, right? It must be cheaper, or there must be a solution to do it cheaper. And so we said, let's rally €1,000 from friends and family and try to have as much impact per dollar that we could possibly do, right? And so we use all of our contacts and ended up with a small region in Kenya where we knew people for many years and knew sort of like the surroundings and had a little bit of a network there. And engaged in what is called a fuel-efficient cook stove project, or we set it up. And it's basically the distribution of little clay stoves. It's sort of like it's a clay stove that is being locally produced. So it's being the clay is locally sourced. It's locally produced by women initiatives or potteries. And we basically just help with the financing of it. One of these stoves costs around $1.50, or used to cost $1.50 when we started the project. And so then, someone needs to pick it up. Someone needs to go to a household. Someone needs to then install it. And installing means you put that little burned inlet or liner of a stove, in the kitchen, usually two side by side, because we also don't cook on just one flame of gas, or on like our stoves usually even have four, so it makes sense. If you boil your rice, you also do your meat or your sauce or your tea. So you have usually we distribute two stoves, and then they build like a clay foundation around it, so they're embedded in clay. So it becomes actually this pretty big white thing where you can put your utensils and cooking ware and stuff like that, and then you fire it through a little hole in the on the front. And because all of the flames are, if you burn it or if you light it up, the flames are being directed, up towards the opening where you put your stove, your pan, and so therefore the heat and the energy is being directed immediately onto the pan or the pot.
Yep.
And in comparison to what they usually use, which is a 3-stone fire, globally, the most used form of cooking is you just use you make a fire and you put 3 stones, and onto those 3 stones you put your cooking ware. It of course has a massive energy efficiency effect, right? So
Yeah.
you save a lot of energy on that. So that's sort of like the basics behind it. The side, well, so that's the technology part, right?
Yeah.
We supported that. The site or the whole project is embedded in the concept that there is a forest around, like in that area, that is one of the last remnants of an ancient or like an old forest type that used to spread around the entire belt or African in that section, African continent. And it's a very important breeding site for birds, and migrating birds are resting there. It's worldwide known, and so but it's also being used because the region in Kenya there is very fertile. So many people live there and grow crops, and so all of them need to cook, and they all cook on open fires. And so this forest basically provides the last bit of timber, of fuel wood for families, and these families, they need it, right? So you need to feed your family. So it's not like an option or like a commodity that it's nice to have. It's you need it for survival. And so all of these people go to the forest. They take out dead wood because they're legally only allowed to take dead wood. But of course, the forest doesn't produce that much dead wood, so they start cutting, which I really don't blame them. They need the timber, and so that's what leads to the decline of that forest, of that last bit of forest that remains. And so by reducing the amount of fuel wood through these energy-saving stoves, you therefore take pressure from the forests, right? In theory. Full stop. So that's the whole idea, right? So you have a forest that you're trying to protect. From what do you try to protect it from? Well, from people taking out too much fuel wood. Why are they taking it out? Well, because they need to eat, right? They need to make a fire. So what is the alternative? What is the strategic entry point? Strategic entry point is we don't say to people, oh, you're not allowed to cook anymore, but we provide them with a solution that is very low tech. It's not, produced in Europe, or, we don't have to ship any complicated mechanical parts. It's all there. All of the capacities are there. They can build it. They can repair it. All is in their hands. And then more people use more stoves means more people use less wood. Therefore, the forest keeps more of its wood, and therefore remains a healthier ecosystem. In very big quotation marks, because there is a lot of dynamics that go on, but that's sort of like the basic structure of, or like strategic lining, if you will. There is many side effects, positive side effects, but also negative side effects that we can debate. And there's a huge debate around fuel efficient cook stoves, because also it reduces, because it's a cleaner burn, so it reduces the amount of smoke. People cook indoors. Many women and children who are usually still responsible for the cooking, they sit in the kitchen and they get respiratory problems because they sit in the smoke all day.
Right.
And now you think, well, if you reduce the smoke, that's even, you even have a health benefit for those people, which is great, which is true, but also not. Because if you reduce the smoke to zero, let's say if you use the vent, you have a malaria issue, because people also want that smoke because it protects them from malaria, mosquitoes, and flies that transmit diseases, right? So you have a side effect, an unintended side effect that you didn't want to generate. And also, if you just reduce it by a little bit, people can sit in the smoke for longer. And so the effects that this little bit of smoke has is even higher than if they sat in a kitchen that has a lot of smoke, but you every once in a while go out because the smoke is too dense, right? So there is so many facets to that issue. It's not that, oh, that's a perfect solution, let's do it, everything will be solved, right? So there is so many details. And these are the things that I also go through with my teams, that they usually have very good ideas, but somehow they've done it for 15 years and it just didn't work out, or it just wasn't enough, or they, like there's all these new challenges that came, but they really only wanted to protect those elephants. Yeah. And say, yeah, but unfortunately, the world is not that easy sometimes. And so
I think it shows so clearly, actually. It's one of the best examples I think I've ever heard, really, about how conservation is about people. Yeah. And you said Absolutely. It yourself, and I've heard it so many times, conservation is about people. You go in because you're concerned about this decline of a bird species in this forest. Well, how do you go about tackling that as a conservationist? You create fuel efficient stoves, and you install them in houses, which has other consequences, and so on. And you realize that as a conservationist, you're doing kind of different activities, but to perhaps what you thought you might be doing, but that is how you tackle the root causes. And that's how change occurs, because you're trying to find the win-wins for the local communities and the birds at the same time. People often don't want to destruct, their forests. They want to see the birds thrive, but they need to live too. So we need to provide these alternative livelihoods, or alternative ways of living. That, and it takes that sort of innovative approach. It's a very different skill set as a conservationist you need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm fairly certain, even though I have an ecology background, I would by now make a terrible ecologist, because I just haven't, worked as an ecologist for the last 15 years. I've worked as a problem solver for teams that work in, let's say, ecological fields, right? Or in the conservation sector. So in that sense, I'm trying to help solve problems and challenges rather than, being that perfect expert on that one species. And those perfect experts are also needed, right? So that's very specialized skill and knowledge on certain ecosystems or species or population dynamics. It is very crucial to build up, a thorough strategy, or, to do your assessments and create or design conservation projects and programs. So it's a very nice harmony in between the two. Like, I don't need to be the content expert. I need to be the expert in the process and in guiding and leading people through a specific process. And I need to have those content experts on the team so that they can answer the questions that I ask, right? So if I ask, how healthy are the elephants? They likely will not be able to say 69.5. But if I ask the right question and say, well, how many cubs of that species are surviving? Is that within the range, or is that good, or is that bad? Then we get into a discussion, and then all of a sudden you talk about a viability assessment, an assessment on the viability, the health status of a species, if you will, and then we can and then we get a result, and then all of a sudden we say, or we might even be able to say, you're putting all that effort into that species, but the species is not at risk. Not at all. Like, is it worth doing that? And and ask these questions. And sometimes you say, it's worth it. Sometimes it's, you're right. We love that species, but maybe we're putting a little bit too much of an emphasis on that one particular species. And there's other really cute, important and lovable things out there that we could also, support a little bit more, because that one species really doesn't need it. It's thriving.
Or we've been having all this effort for so many years and it's had no impact at all.
Actually. Or
it's not
even
working.
Worse. Exactly.
Shift, adapt, change, rethink.
Yeah, and then like in conservation, as we all know, there's donor requirements. So sometimes you need to protect a species because the donor loves it. But then with that money, or with protecting that species, serves as an umbrella species, and you can protect all these other species that are not so lovable, but are very important to the functioning of that particular ecosystem.
So it makes me think, like, so we've been looking at fundraising recently at Conservation Careers, and I found a statistic which was $91 billion per year is targeted towards environmental conservation initiatives. Do you think that those funds could be used much more effectively if people had a more systematic approach to designing, developing, managing better projects, as you're describing? Do you think the conservation sector as a whole could be more efficient and effective with funds that are raised for it and have more of an impact?
Absolutely. I mean, and that is that is me saying that without really having that much understanding of those numbers, because these numbers are so high.
Yep.
I couldn't judge if that is that too much? Is that not enough? Are we halfway there? Is it just 10% of what we need?
Yeah.
Or is it 95% of what we need? So without even knowing details about that particular number, we can always be much better, right? I mean, we can always learn better from one another and communicate more with one another, and therefore become better at anything, right? Even if it's juggling with 5 balls. You learn that you can teach it yourself, but it's likely easier for you to learn if you have someone standing next to you who can already do it and show you the tricks and give you tips on how to stand, how to catch ball 3 and ball 5 and where to toss it exactly, and it's an analogy, but we need to juggle a lot of balls usually. Or keep them up in the air, and we can absolutely. We should become much better in communicating and exchanging, sharing knowledge. Not only what has worked. I mean, it's nice to boast and be proud of your work that was successful, but equally important is to talk about failures and what didn't work. And at least in Germany, we're not a very failure-open society, unfortunately. But it's so important to say, we failed with that. We fell down face first. Don't do that. Or if you want to do the same thing that we did, really consider if in your context that really makes sense. And maybe it does. But please know that we completely failed with it. And so you might want to think twice. It's not to say that everyone who falls has a story where, to share that if people avoid it, they will never fall. It's not that, but it's really that, in our context, it hasn't worked. And we try to analyze why, and here's our reasoning why we think we didn't succeed. So think about your situation, and maybe you're facing similar challenges, or the setting is a very similar one. So you may want to adapt and take a slightly different approach than what we did. In order to avoid that failure for your work.
So I'm kind of coming back to listening to you about this idea that conservationists are very well trained. They have the expertise in the subject matter, the local context, but sometimes, and maybe often, I don't know, they don't have the formalized training in your expertise, in the process, in the really understanding the root causes, the drivers, the threats, the strategies you might deploy, the adapting according to, getting the feedback and the failures and successes and everything else. And that whole process about designing, implementing, and going further, managing, fundraising, and all, that side of stuff. It feels like a lot of that is kind of learned on the job through failures and successes and so forth, but you can speed that up. It can be taught, and there are frameworks out there, aren't they, called the conservation standards, and there are others out there too, to help people to provide this process that that you can actually sit down, learn, and then apply, and you'll have it will increase your chances of success and of impact and of making the most out of the precious resources we have for conservation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned it, the conservation standards, or the open standards for the practice of conservation, which is the long term, is a methodological approach to designing and managing and also implementing conservation projects. And it goes beyond that. It also includes steps that help you learn how to pause and reflect, or analyze, look back of what has happened and what didn't maybe work out that well, and then you adapt your strategic actions and try to get back on track. And then last but not least, share the knowledge and share the lessons learned. So yeah, there is methodological frameworks for that in conservation. To be honest, I mean, there's many different concepts, let's say, or not concepts, but different frameworks and planning tools. There is the conservation standards, which I consider one of the leading, if not the leading, mechanism or framework out there. And I can explain in much more detail why I think it is exactly that. But you're right. Many people, even though they work in conservation, they lack those skills, and that's actually coming back to what I said at the very, very beginning of our call. My job should be obsolete in terms of knowing the methodology and understanding, the structure of how you do those types of assessments or how you do plan a process. But apparently it's not. And to be honest, if I started out working in a conservation organization right after my studies, I would have not. I likely would have been at the same place that people are now. In my study program, I was so lucky that actually the conservation standards was embedded in my study program. Wow. But that was only because there was a very dedicated professor of mine who has become my mentor at some point, and I wrote my theses with him, who was fully sold on the idea of a joint language, a joint methodological approach, a world where conservationists exchange thoughts and lessons learned. And so he luckily taught adaptive management in that study program. But I know, as a matter of fact, that there's only a handful of universities or of individual institutions that actually do that. And so, unfortunately. And so if you study biology, right, and you end up in conservation, that's fantastic, but you lack those methodological project design, project planning, implementing, evaluating, or monitoring and then evaluating type skills that you also need, apart from, like I said, the ecological background, the biological background.
Yep.
But you usually lack those methodological backgrounds for planning and implementing.
I find that almost crazy as well, actually, like when you sort of reflect on it, like, as you sort of articulated that, and it's a discussion for another day, maybe, that employers are looking for this. When we look across the market, employers are looking for conservationists who can design, manage, fundraise, communicate, amongst other things, conservation projects to a high standard. But I feel like the universities, let's put it that way, and the institutions around them are not keeping up with what employers are looking for, and there is that gap. We classically teach biology and ecology and these kind of knowledge-based subjects, but actually lack some of the skills that makes you employable and effective in the workplace. And that's it's another discussion maybe, but that's something that really does need to catch up a little bit. And there are a few universities out there that are teaching this, but many more really should, actually, when you think about it. And employers should be also teaching their staff, as an extension.
Yeah. And even, to go even beyond that, even donors should know those types of methodologies in order to request a certain type of reporting from those organizations or projects that they financially support. Because that's also a huge gap, that many of the projects, even though they are using the standards, for managing their projects, they then have to switch the format in order to speak the donor's language, or to appeal to the format that the donor expects their reports in, which is completely only for the donor's interest, but not for the organization. So they spend a lot of time actually, tweaking stuff and redesigning stuff, and spending valuable time on that reporting need to the donor. And I understand that you need to report to the person or the institution that gave you financial funds, but not to the extent where it jeopardizes the real work that you do, right? The backbone of your of your organization, which should always be conservation. You do need to do marketing and communications and all that. But the soul, your heart lies in conservation, right? It's the impact in the field that you want to achieve.
The project is the beating heart, really, of the conservation action on the ground, and having a standard that enables you to work more efficiently and for donors to have higher confidence and to be able to communicate better with one another creates more impact, which is what everyone wants. How were the conservation standards created, or how have they been maintained and improved? Is it an individual? Is it a community? Like, where'd they come from? How do we know they're any good?
Well, short history on the conservation standards. I try to keep it brief. In a nutshell, it's been an evolution, let's say, for around 20 years by now. Some say even a little bit longer. But it all started with a handful of individuals coming from organizations that all worked in conservation, of course. And they said, we are unable to communicate effectively and talk to one another and understand one another. And I give you an example. So when you say, what you call a conservation target, I might call a conservation aim, and someone else might call it an objective, and someone else might call it an object, right? And so, but these are 4 terms that I just provided with completely different, or could have completely different meanings within one organization, but because they're spread out, all of the people that use these 4 terms are talking exactly about exactly the same thing, right? And so, they sat together and said, well, let's create one common approach to conservation, or to conservation planning. Let's create one common lingo for that, one unified language that we all speak. So if I say strategy, you exactly know what I mean. With strategy, that's a very, term that is commonly used for the same thing. But then once we go one level deeper and we say activity, someone else might say action or intervention. And so, and so they said, let's unify that lingo, that language, and come up with one glossary with the key terms that we all need in conservation, so that we can more effectively talk to one another and learn from one another. That was the whole concept, right? And so from that moment on, the standards were born. They were called differently throughout times, but they are now called in long the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation, a very clunky name, I find. That's why the shorthand is the Conservation Standards, or CS, as we sometimes abbreviate it. And more organizations joined, right? And so until now, to be honest, I'd have to lie, but I think we are at 20 organizations that make up what is called CMP, the Conservation Measures Partnership, a partnership of organizations that endorse and support the conservation standards, so the methodology, and say, we fully believe in that concept of speaking one language. We believe in the concept of sharing knowledge, of exchanging thoughts and ideas and lessons learned, and full stop. And we want to protect or ensure that the standards are always up to pair, let's say, right? So that the quality standards are kept. And so CMP, the Conservation Measures Partnership, is that group of organizations basically that are, let's say, the watchdogs for the standards. The standards themselves are open source, right? So you're welcome to download them, you're welcome to use them, you're welcome to do anything with it as long as you abide to the rules of open source. And CMP, the Conservation Measures Partnership, is really only there to ensure that certain working groups exist to tackle certain topics. For example, a few years back, when climate change was still not that well integrated, there was a working group that really tried to tackle climate change not only as that one threat that is threatening the forest, but really as a more fundamental issue that we need to incorporate into the methodology almost on all levels.
Yeah.
Right. It's not only affecting the target, it's affecting the people. I mean, there's so many layers to climate change. We can't just put it in one box and call it climate change and say we integrated climate change. No, we didn't.
Yeah.
Right. And so these things, or human well-being, right? Or gender, and like all of these topics that 20 years ago weren't, let's say, that prominent or that known. But of course, things change, right? And it's all built on adaptive management. So the conservation standards embodies adaptive management, meaning it's not a linear planning. You don't say we are here today and in 5 years we want to be there. This is the plan, let's go. But it's rather to say we're here today. This is where we want to be in 5 years. Let's set up little measuring points along the way so that we are able to track the progress towards that 5 or 10 or 15 or 20-year goal. And if we don't meet those tiny little goals, we have a measure, like we have almost like an early warning system, something that helps us to track, are we still on the right, road, on track? Or did something happen that we just didn't foresee, right? And so if we deviate and if we don't make those little tiny, connections, we can, let's say, every 6 months let's say every 6 months, we sit down, we do a little bit of a revision, we look back, we look forward, and we say, are we still, okay, good, then let's continue. But then if we say, oh no, actually we're not at all where we want it to be, then you can sit down and say, well, why is that? Was it because that mini, that mini step was just too ambitious? Or did something fundamental happen that we didn't foresee that, put us off track? And is there a way for us to get back on track? And so, and so that's sort of like the concept of adaptive management. And the standards embody conservation, adaptive management, and therefore they will never be finished. I mean, they are always developing. And that's why CMP is trying to ensure that these topics, or these, that new topics are being integrated into the standards as best as possible. I have to say that sometimes that also takes a lot of time, and sometimes we are not quick enough. So I'm not saying that everything is perfect, but I do believe that it's good to have a group of organizations that is trying to safeguard one common approach to, in that case, project management. Or design and management. But we have to, sometimes we likely have to be a little bit better in terms of being more agile, being faster in developing, solutions to some of the things that come. But
it is where it is, and it's incredible, really, that that there is now this unifying language. There is this process. It's maintained and improved, and there's a huge upwelling of organizations supporting and using it. But it sounds like more people should be using it too. As we kind of wrap up, I'm just conscious of our time as well today, and I could talk forever. I find this so interesting. But so coming back to your role then, Felix, in all this as a consultant, what do you kind of like about your job that you'd like to share with people, and what the sort of main challenges, what the kind of likes and dislikes about your duties, and people that might be thinking, oh, that sounds an interesting role you're doing, like what would you like to share about doing your job?
Well, like I said, what I love about my job is that it always surprises me. Yet again, every team that I work with is different. Every situation that those teams are facing is different. I might work on a coral reef here and then on a coral reef there, and both of the situations are completely different, even though we're talking about almost exactly the same thing. And so that is something that I really value. I have a lot of diversity and a lot of so so it's never really monotonous. It's very diverse, and that's something, at least for me, that I love. Like I said, the people, 99% of the people that I work with are fantastic and engaged and insanely motivated despite all of the challenges that they are facing on site. So that is also truly inspiring. It is, so it's actually, I think it's these two things on the positive end that I really like. I mean, with Corona and the global pandemic, a lot of people have become used to working from home.
Yep.
Having these virtual meetings is more accepted than ever. We have been doing that for the last 12 years, right? So, but I'd say 5 years ago, if a cat would run across your table or if your kids are screaming in the background, that would have been less accepted than it is today, right? And so in that sense, we've come a long way. And I think the setup for working the way that I work, with across the globe, with multiple time zones a day, with teams spread around, and also with the technological possibilities that we have, speaking to people that are really remote, somewhere out in the forest, simply because cell phones and smartphones exist, and cell phone coverage in these areas is sometimes better than electricity. So you can do your calls via WhatsApp. You don't need a computer with Zoom or big Excel spreadsheets. You can, we have come a very long way. And so in that sense, that's very rewarding, to be able to do less traveling. Before the pandemic, I used to travel a lot, of course, a lot of in-person meetings. Yeah. And it's not that every in-person meeting can be substituted by a virtual one. Meeting in person, especially in these group dynamic situations, it's important to see people and to work with people, but not always. You don't always have to travel for every meeting or for every conference there is. You can just tune in and provide an equally good input to that session or to that process, and so that is fantastic.
Presumably, as part of your work, you need to be a little bit of a salesperson too. You need to generate your own work. No one's without sharing any secrets or whatever. Share as much as you want. But how do you go about securing work? Is it all word of mouth? Do you get recommendations? Where do people start? Because if you're an introvert and you don't want to be making sales calls or reaching out or networking or however you get this thing going, how does that side of the business side? Because when you work alone, there's a careful balance between not having enough work and being a little bit worried about income, and having too much work, which is great for income, but it's stressful in maintaining that balance. And talk to that if you wouldn't mind. Yeah.
And also mindful of time. So I think I have never, there has been only a few times where I actively applied for a job, or responded to a call for proposal. Call for proposals are differently, but because sometimes you do have to do that. But mostly, there's a lot, let's say 50-60%, likely more than 50% of the jobs or the processes that I'm involved with come from word to mouth. And so am I a salesperson? I don't think so. I consider myself to be actually not that much of an extrovert either. But I do enjoy, I'm very easy to connect with people. I do enjoy talking to people. I do enjoy, asking questions. I'm very interested, curious type person, I think.
Yeah.
You need to, I think you need to be, in order to work in exactly the position that I work in as an external consultant, helping teams through certain processes. You need to have that curiosity. You need to have that problem solving attitude that you say, fantastic, another problem, explain it to me. Okay, give me more details. And then your mind goes and then you ask questions. And so in that sense, yeah, that you need. It's not a job where you can sit quietly in the corner and just, work through a table and be done with it, and everybody's happy because you've done a fantastic job.
Yeah.
You need to be able to connect to people and to talk to people, and also, like, have a sense for the nuances of group dynamics, of how the personality of someone that you work with really is, like what makes them tick, like are there power dynamics within a conference room or within a virtual call, right? Who is quiet, who is more talkative, who do you have to slow down, who do you have to lift up? So you need to have, but I think that's also something that you need to develop over time. I certainly wasn't as good as I am now, and I still have a long way to go, of course, with that, but yeah, I work with people. I don't work with the forest. I work with people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As my last question then, really, like you've mentioned it already in some respects, like, when we look across the world, at the kind of state of biodiversity, like just focusing on wildlife, nature, whatever we want to call it, largely speaking, the reports that we hear are very negative. We're sort of losing the battle. We might be winning a few little, issues here and there, but globally we're losing. Like, are you optimistic for the future of conservation and this sector that we're engaged in?
Fantastic question to end with. I mean it. All right, it's a multi-layered response here. First of all, my professor used to say, and I have his words in my mind almost every day. The key skill for you, when I did my master's in global change management, the key skill for you is frustration tolerance. And he was so right. So you need to be able to tolerate a certain level of frustration in your job. That's just the way things are.
I've never heard it like that before. I like it.
Yeah. Well, we are facing the biggest threats out there. We are fighting, the biggest companies, the most powerful, most evil industries out there, in conservation, usually. And that is a very daunting task. And it's, and also sometimes for some of the teams, it's actually also a very dangerous job to take on, because illegal wildlife trade, mining companies, timber exploiting companies, they, at this point, as we all know, they're not scared to use lethal force, to get what they want. So in that sense, it's a dangerous job for many of the people out there working, on the ground. Less for me, obviously, but for them, for sure. And but for me and for the teams as well, it's very frustrating. Yes, and so frustration tolerance is one of the key skills that you need. Point one. Point two is, on a global scale, I'm very optimistic. Not to say that we will save this planet, but we also never intended to save this planet, or at least I didn't. Right? And as we said, conservation is about people. We're trying to make life more livable for us as a human species on this planet. And if it wasn't for conservation, we don't know where we would be today if we didn't do what we have done for the last 30, 40, 50 years, right? The planet would be at a much worse state. We just can't say where it is. Yeah. Now, the question is it enough? We can also not say that, right? So looking towards the future, the only thing we can say is it's definitely worth doing what we do. It's definitely worth protecting, the functionality of our ecosystems, but not because we love the polar bears so much. It's not because we love the Amazon forest. It's because we depend on them. We, as a human species, and I think it's a big puzzle that we all contribute a little piece towards. So people who work in conflict management, right? Who are working in hospitals, who are doctors and I mean, there's so many jobs out there that are so important for the survival of our species. It's not conservation alone, but conservation is one of the key pillars. Biodiversity and functioning biodiversity is a key pillar of the well-being of our species. And so in that sense, yes, it's absolutely worth it. It's absolutely crucial that we do it. Mm-hmm. Is it enough? We don't know, but it's definitely not recommended to do less. I'd say.
And we should do more with what we've got.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, as with the number before, I don't know how much will be sufficient. No one knows. But I also think it's not about finding out that perfect number. It's about, the indicators should be, are there people still starving on this planet because they don't have food? Are there people dying from illnesses that are easily treatable? Those are the indicators. And if the answer is yes, well, then we haven't done enough, right? And it's not that we in conservation have done enough, but it's we as a human species. We have not done enough in order to protect us as a species. And so my piece or our piece from us working in conservation is the piece of the puzzle is we contribute on that conservation front or on that conservation end, and others work with children in childcare or daycare for children. Others work in hospitals. Others, I mean, there is a gazillion jobs that are very, very important for the well-being of our species.
Absolutely.
So I just see, there will never be that magic button for us, but we're contributing our little piece of the puzzle.
Amen to that. I mean, I must have asked that question, I don't know, in its various forms 50, 100 times. And I think that's one of the most thought-provoking answers I think I've ever heard. Yeah, really. Yeah. And it's been one of the most enjoyable conversations too. So Felix, thank you. Thank you for being our course leader. If people want to find out a bit more about the sort of stuff you do and to learn about conservation standards, it would be remiss for me not to mention we have a course about it, which we're calling Project Design and Management for Conservation Projects. So you can jump in, find out more about that. Felix, you're our course leader. Thank you for being a fantastic course leader. If people want to find out a bit more about you, yeah, you're very welcome, and the work that you're doing, where should we point them? Is there a place they can go and find a bit more about you?
Good question. I do have a small website, but it's nothing. I mean, yeah, you can contact me via the website. It's my last name.org, Cybulla. Yep. But yeah, you'll find my contact details on your website, Conservation Careers.
Yep.
And if you Google me, you'll also find my profiles out there in this
I can confirm that because I've done that myself. Yeah. All right. Once again, yeah. Thank you so much, Felix, for joining the podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and you want to learn more about improving your project skills and get support from Felix, then please check out our course, Conservation, Project Management and Design. And also do consider leaving us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to your podcast, as it really helps us to get in front of more people. Okay, this is Nick signing out. Till next time, keep conservationing.